And now it is 12 noon here in beautiful Denver, Colorado, and I hope it's also beautiful wherever you are. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Mary Medley, the CEO for the Colorado Society of CPAs, and I'm really excited to have you experience another, if you've been here before, or the first one, if you haven't, CME, Story of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, with our storyteller today, Judy Thomas, who is chair of the Accounting, Economics, and Finance and Associate Professor of Practice in the Anderson College of Business and Computing for Regis University in Denver. Judy is a member of our DE&I working group, and we said to her, "Don't you think you have a story to tell too?" And she said, "Yes, I do." And so we are honored, Judy, to have you with us today. And the way this works, for those of you who haven't joined us previously, is that Judy will tell her story, share her story, and then we'll open it up for questions, observations, comments. We are scheduled to go till 1:15 today. So please join me in welcoming Judy Thomas for her story, Coming to America.
Thank you, Mary. Welcome, everyone. I hope you find the story, if not interesting, at least a little bit intriguing. So we're off and running, hopefully. I used to say when I was a kid, when I couldn't do things that I wanted to do, why can't I do it? And my dad would say to me, well, your mom is not like everyone else's mom. And so it's an interesting story why my mom is not like or everyone else's mom. So this is a story of Don and Mitzi Lance and their adopted daughters, Joyce and Judy. And my mom, Mitzi, was a war bride. She met Don when he was in Japan as a military member, a GI, during the military occupation, the Allied occupation of Japan. And we, Joyce and I, are half American, half Japanese. So it's their story as well, my story. And I'm going to talk about the circumstances of our adoption and the results. And then part of our story has to do with this concept of Japanese face and how it affected our childhood, because a little bit different than a lot of other Japanese children, it had a huge effect on our childhood and growing up. And then I'll add a conclusion about where we are today, not really where we are today, but what we're doing today. And so just kind of the highlights. So we have to start the story with a little bit of history. And so after World War II ended, the Allied troops, predominantly US troops, arrived in Japan to begin the period known as the Allied occupation. And the occupation served basically two purposes: to keep the Japanese people from starving and from their economy from collapsing socially. But also, the Allies didn't want the Japanese to build another war machine. And so for the Japanese women, the daughters of Japan who had survived the war, they found themselves in need of jobs, because remember, it's a war-torn, ravaged country, and so they needed to support themselves. And so the Americans taught these women English and how to do office work, and they hired these women to be secretaries or clerks or maids or nannies. And some of these women also found work in nightclubs and cabarets. But the military discouraged fraternization with the Japanese women, between the soldiers and the Japanese women. But like all things, fraternization did occur. The Japanese men who had come back from the war were physically and mentally disabled. And so to the Japanese women, these handsome and generous men, these Americans, were attractive to these women. They would open doors for the women. They treated them well, but they also gave the women candy, dresses, other trinkets, things that the Japanese men did not do. And so it wasn't long before the American soldiers and the Japanese women fell in love. They wanted to get married, and the American soldiers wanted to take their war brides home. But the Japanese families were not in favor of their daughters dating American soldiers. It was a blemish to these families. And so some of the Japanese families would disown their daughters and erase them from the family registry. The US government wasn't in favor of these liaisons either. The men faced tremendous legal hurdles to bring home these Japanese wives. In fact, until the McCarran-Walter Act, it was illegal. There was no encouragement to bring Asian women to the United States. So we're not just women, Japanese and Chinese, Asians to the United States. They weren't allowed. There was no immigration for them. The McCarran-Walter Act and the immigration laws up until that point did not allow them because it was a anti-communism type of immigration laws that existed. But McCarran-Walter allowed Japanese and Chinese to immigrate to the United States. However, they were in very limited amounts, but that legal hurdle was overcome, even in limited amounts. And so there was a door that was opened. The commanding officers also discouraged these relationships, and the paperwork was overwhelming and burdensome for these GIs to be able to marry, excuse me, and try to bring home their war brides. And at that point, in many states, over half interracial marriages were still banned. So that created a barrier as well. But as these barriers started to break down, the military accepted the fact that these men were going to bring home these Japanese brides. And so I have a video that shows these bride schools that the military set up to teach the women, the Japanese brides, how to fit in.
Mrs. Hammond, you and your husband, General Hammond, have taken a great deal of interest in this project. Would you tell us how the idea got started?
Yes, it started because the American service husbands wanted some sort of a school for their Japanese brides so that they would learn the American way of life.
The American customs and the Japanese customs are just a wee bit different. For instance, when we meet somebody, we say, "How do you do?" We nod our heads and we don't bow like this. It's very nice, but we don't do it.
What is the most difficult thing that you have to teach the girls as far as American customs are concerned?
Well, I think the most difficult thing for the girls to learn here has been walking on high heels, because you see they are used to walking in low heels.
What are you looking forward to seeing most in America when you get there?
Washington, D.C. and the White House.
And the White House, where the president lives? Do you think the girls will make good American citizens?
Yes, they have been very receptive to this course, and I feel that with the aid of the American public, they'll make excellent American wives.
Fine. Thank you very much, Mrs. Hammond.
Oops. So as you can see, hopefully, is everybody with me?
We're all here. We are all here, Judy. Are you still trying to show slides?
Yes.
Okay, they haven't come up yet.
Okay. Let me try that again. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Let's try to share. Are my slides up?
Now they are. Yes, now they are.
Okay. So rather than go back and pick up the last point, a lot of the Japanese brides found themselves with American names because they were easier to pronounce. So a lot of my mom's friends had names like Terry and Susie, and even my mom, fortunately, she had a relatively easy name to convert. So her name was Mitzi, but some of them were totally different than their Japanese names. So a lot of changes from the Japanese way of doing things versus adapting to the American way of doing things, which you could see from the video that we just saw. So one of the other things that before we get into the real story is this concept of face. And although we could probably equate it to the idea of honor, it's not quite honor. And so as the Japanese women coming to the United States struggled to adapt and learn about their new homeland, the American families and friends had to learn and understand about the women and their culture. And one of the more difficult concepts to understand about Japanese is this concept of face, because it's very different from what we understand from honor. So for us, honor is individual. The idea of doing what's right. And I don't want to say that Japanese people don't do what's right, but for Japanese, it's all about the family, the clan, bringing no shame to the family, the clan, etc. And so individual is not as important. It's the supremacy of the family, the group, bringing honor to your clan, the collective. In the West, for us, it's more about personal integrity. We admire the person who can stand up and say, I did this wrong. I have committed this. For us in accounting, the idea of, objectivity or due professional care, etc. I made a mistake. I admit that I made a mistake, and I'm going to atone for my error. That's how we are. And in Japan, we might not do the same things. We might not personally admit that we've made a mistake if it will bring shame to the family, to the clan, etc. We always want to appear as doing the right thing for the clan. And so it doesn't keep the Japanese from bald-faced lying if that's what it involves. So, for example, and this is a very simple example, if we ran an inn in Japan, a guest house, and someone came up, an American came up and said, do you have any vacancies? And perhaps the inn is almost empty. The innkeeper might say, no, we are full, which is a bald-faced lie. But rather than say, we do not admit or let out rooms to Americans, they would bald-faced lie in order to keep Americans out, because that would bring shame to the inn to say, hey, we don't let foreigners in. So personal relationships versus social harmony. We want to keep social harmony. And the idea of ethics is situational. In other words, in Japan, if an American were to come up and speak English, Japanese would try to speak English back. That's what they do. But they would rather avoid speaking to Americans in English because they would feel that they would be ridiculed for not speaking English very well, being misunderstood, etc. And so Americans would tend to think, oh, these people are very shy. They don't want to communicate, but they don't want to communicate because they don't want people to laugh at them, to make fun of them, make a mistake and use the wrong words, etc. And so depending on the situation, they may not tell the truth. They may, because it may bring shame to the family, etc. And the reason I bring this up is you will see a little bit later in the story how face affected our family. So here we go. Here's the story. All right, so Mitsuko Shimojo was born May 30th, 1930. She is a war bride. She met my dad in Japan. My dad, his name is Harry. Everybody called him Don because his dad's name was Harry as well. And he was born on August 1st, 1929. And what you might find interesting about their dates of birth is that they were born during the time of the Depression. My dad, his dad was a migrant vegetable picker. I would say fruit picker, because he was born in Vero Beach, Florida, and his dad picked citrus fruit. And as the crops rotated, his dad would go up the coast and pick different fruit. He did have other jobs, but needless to say, he was not in the wealthy class. He was very poor. And so for my dad, he grew up very poor. The Great Depression affected him as he grew up very deeply. As he got older, you could see in a lot of things that he did he wanted to make up for all the things that he had missed growing up. And so when we'd go to a restaurant, he would ask for lots of butter. He would ask for gobs of ranch for his salads, etc. And as we grew up, he wanted to make sure within his means that we got to do the things that he never got to do. And you would have seen him as a big kid when he took us to Disneyland. He's the first one on the teacups, and he would just spin it like crazy. And we would be so sick, but he was having the time of his life. In Japan, it was much the same situation for my mom. She grew up near Toyama, Japan, and her father was killed during the war, and her brother had to escape Japan. He fled to China. And so it was just her mom, her sister, and her. And they had nothing. There was a point in time where they were eating the tops of sweet potatoes, etc. So they almost starved to death. And so this had a very profound effect on how she grew up as well. So they both were very, very poor. And so when the war was over, her brother did come back. He eventually got a job with the Postal Service, but she left to find work. She did find work as a nanny for the military and took care of kids. But they met each other, and they fell in love, and they wanted to get married. And so, as I had mentioned, the obstacles were huge. My dad had to meet with his commander, the chaplain. And it's kind of funny in a way, because the chaplain was very concerned, because there is an assumption that all Japanese are Buddhist. And so there is a sect of Buddhism that is much more radical. It is Soka Gakkai, and they are, or were at that time, considered kind of the catalyst for wanting to take over the world, I guess. Probably not the world, but part of the war machine. And so the chaplain had asked my dad, do you know your future wife's or your bride's religious beliefs? And my dad looked at the chaplain and he said, well, sir, perhaps you should ask her. She's a member of your congregation. So after a lot of counseling and talking to various members of the hierarchy, they did get permission to get married, and they got married, and my mom, Mitsuko Shimojo, became Mrs. Harry D. Lance. So here they are. I called it date night, but for the Lances, life was good for a bit of time because they were stationed in Japan, and they knew a lot of other couples that were married to Japanese as well. So there wasn't a lot of pressure at that point for my mom and dad to become American. And so life was peaceful for a little while. But as with all things, my dad got assigned back to the United States. And so life changed for them. And interestingly enough, my dad is not a big fan of Japanese food. And so my mom had to learn how to cook Southern food and American food. And she learned from my dad's grandmother. Fortunately for my mom, she's a pretty good seamstress. I keep saying she is. My mom has passed away, but she learned to make her own clothing in American fashion so she could fit in. And there were a few Japanese American couples, so she could hang out with some of them, but she did take English class and citizenship classes so she could become a US citizen. And while life wasn't perfect, they were happy together. But fate has it that Don received orders to go back to Japan, and life took an interesting turn at that point. So my folks weren't able to have kids of their own. And from the occupation, there were lots of half and half orphans, half American, half Japanese, that were looking for homes. And so half and halves were not accepted by the Japanese. They tend to be a little bit racist too, and they want purebloods to be accepted into the Japanese culture. So a lot were sitting in orphanages. Interestingly, my mom wanted a girl, my dad wanted a boy, and what they got were twin girls. So these twin girls, they happened to become acquainted with or learn about through their friends that they knew in Japan. These two girls were not necessarily living together because their birth mom could not take care of both of them. So one of them was staying with her and one of them was staying with a friend of hers. And so she had decided, the birth mom had decided that it might be best if she gave them up for adoption. And so it was an opportunity for my mom and dad. And so they went through all the paperwork to adopt the girls, my sister and I. And so up until the very end, when you go to Japanese adoption court, the birth mother has the right to change her mind. And so they go through everything in adoption court. And the last thing that the judge says to the birth mom is, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And the birth mom changed her mind. And she said, "I want to keep one." And she decided she wanted my dad to decide which one. So it was devastating for all of them. And so my dad logically went through it. I'm not going to say how he decided or anything. And so we were split up. And at Christmas time, she brought the other one over. And at that point, she decided that was a really poor decision. And she gave up both of us. And so my mom and dad had both of us adopted. But my dad had promised, promises as a broad term, the birth mom, that he would let her know, keep in touch how we were doing. So he sent her pictures occasionally and kind of kept her up to date about what was going on. She did get married to an American soldier, and as fate would have it, it seems like wherever we were stationed, it seemed that they were stationed in the same place or very close. So this created some really large heartburn for my mother, because she always remembered that at the very last minute, my birth mom changed her mind. There we are. This is at the American Consulate. When we officially, in the Americanized, became recognized as children of Harry and Mitzi. But the thing is, when you are do an adoption, you also have to go through counseling and consultation, etc. The odd thing about all this, and maybe it's not really odd, is that at this point, we are in no man's land, because just because you get adopted doesn't mean you become automatically American citizens. You are not American citizens. You are Japanese citizens. So at this point, we are still considered Japanese citizens. And when we traveled back to the United States, we traveled back on Japanese passports. So, you know, as far as the Japanese are concerned, because we've been adopted, we're not really Japanese either. So again, we are in no man's land. But we have a new family. So mom and dad, it's my mom. And here we are. We created quite a sensation for a while, because we, you know, created the East Meets West and the Double Trouble moniker. So wherever we went, people would, you know, say, "Oh, they're so cute." I don't know what happened after that, but that's what they said. And then after a while, people just accepted that we were just ordinary kids. But it's interesting, because if you were wondering, yes, we did dress alike all the way through junior high. So I was like, oh, can we have different clothes for a while? But my mom made most of our clothes. So yeah. So here we are. The whole idea of saving face. It created lots of problems, because my dad became an officer in the Army. And for my mom, this meant that a whole set of expectations were thrown at her, because she had to join that elite club called an Officers' Wives Club. She had to not bring shame to my dad and the whole military regime. So we had to be American. I told my mother that we couldn't speak Japanese because we were in America, which I live to regret very deeply. And that we, you know, have to do everything perfect. We had to do everything right, because otherwise she would bring shame to my dad's career as an officer in the military, put her best foot forward, etc. She had to have perfect children. She had to show everyone that she was the perfect mother, because she always felt fear that our birth mom would come and take us away. If she did something wrong, that our birth mom would be able to take us away, which of course couldn't happen, wasn't going to happen. But because of that day in adoption court, she believed that that would happen. And to highlight that story, when my sister was an adult, she went to visit our birth mom, But she didn't tell my mom she was going in advance. She told her when she got back, and my mom was devastated. And the first words out of her mouth was, I knew she would take you away. So that fear was very, very real. And so no matter what, it didn't matter where we went, etc., she would say things like to her friends, oh, don't worry about that. Joyce and Judy will do the dishes, etc., because she wanted to show that she had the perfect kids. And she would do her best to avoid any situation where she would lose face. In other words, she didn't want to go to school events because she would have to speak English, and she was afraid that people wouldn't understand her, or she would use the wrong words, etc. And she would bring shame to herself, and she would bring shame to us. So that's kind of what I was alluding to when I was talking about how face would play such a big role in our lives. And for us, growing up, it influenced us as well. We did become US citizens in US District Court here in Denver, Colorado. Now for my mom, you can imagine that she was a parental authority because my dad had lots of temporary duty assignments. He was stationed in Vietnam. Even when he retired, he worked for NASA in Houston. And so we stayed here until he decided whether he wanted to stay in NASA, at NASA. And he had hearing problems. And so he was an audio engineer. And that obviously didn't work out really well. You can't be an audio engineer if you have hearing issues. And he traveled a lot for Beckman Instruments. He worked the swing shift at Rockwell at Rocky Flats. And so she was the parental authority. And that meant that she had to deal with situations in a culture she was not familiar with. Eventually she was, but it put her in uncomfortable situations. And so she did have people who would say, through their intolerance, I'd like to speak to someone who speaks English. My mother spoke very good English. She had an accent, and it would devastate her when someone would say something like that to her. But for us, we had to be perfect children too. By the way, we were not perfect children, but we had to give the impression that we were perfect children. Doing well in school was expected. So if you came home with a report card that had straight A's, it was like, that's what we expect. And it was always a competition between Joyce and I who could get the better report card. And behaving well in front of others was a requirement. You don't mouth off. You don't say things you're not supposed to say. You don't have attitude, etc., especially in front of other people, because I had attitude, but not in front of other people. And then there was the idea that girls don't go to college. They get married and they have babies. So don't expect us to send you to college. And so if you're going to go, you're going to figure out how you're going to get there all by yourself. And there's no huggy, kissy, PDA, any of that kind of stuff, because that's not the Japanese way. That's not how we do things. And if that sounds harsh, it wasn't. We still loved our families. there wasn't ever any doubt that there was love and affection. It's just, it wasn't in a demonstrative way. So we have a culture in our family that was not fully Japanese and it wasn't fully American. And growing up in that, it allowed us to appreciate both. It wasn't, good or bad. It was just that we appreciated both. Not the not learning Japanese thing. Now I look back, I could have used that. But for us, for Joyce and I, we learned to work hard. It was an expectation. We learned to be independent. That we got from my dad. And then we learned what we needed to do to achieve our goals. If we wanted to go to college, then we learned how to do that. The expectations were high, but we learned how to meet them. We loved our family. My mom was not like everyone else's mom, but we loved her. And I can tell you that my kids, they think my mom's not like everybody else's mom. But we grew up successful. And so I could say coming to America, a success story. And there's part of my family at Coors Field, if you're wondering, because I love baseball. And there's my sister. There I am. And my husband, my niece. By the way, my niece has blonde hair and blue eyes. And my son has blonde hair and blue eyes. I don't know that genetics thing. And my daughter, if I didn't say that. So there we go.
So Judy, what is it like now for you, professionally as well as personally, when you have such a rich heritage, when people are confused about your face, the different kind of face?
Well, it's really interesting because no one ever asks or thinks that I am half Japanese. I have had people guess that I'm Native American, that I'm Hispanic, that I'm Italian. The only people who've come close are, interestingly enough, other Asians. And I just think, I am American with Asian. And it's kind of interesting because people, when I was growing up, would say, well, you should put on there that you are a minority and that you are Asian, so that I could qualify for scholarships or whatever the case may be. And I've never felt one way or the other about taking advantage or not taking advantage. I just consider myself a person. So.
Tell us the story of how you chose to pursue accounting as your career path.
Well, it's kind of interesting because my dad had his own business when I was in high school, and he just decided I needed to help him keep the books. And that's kind of how I went down that path.
So they weren't going to help you go to college, but they were happy to have you help run the family business.
Right.
Yeah. Who was the biggest influence in your decision to pursue accounting, that is?
My dad had a good friend who was a CPA, and he's the one who had the biggest influence on my deciding to be an accountant. That and the fact that I figured out political science wasn't gonna, an undergrad in political science wasn't gonna get me any money or a job.
And how about the path to teaching?
Interestingly, I had a job in a manufacturing plant, and I wanted people to understand that everyone has an influence in profitability. And so I started training sessions on the manufacturing floor, showing all of them how they were a part of profit. And I decided, wow, they really enjoyed it. And I thought, if I can influence people as to how they play a part in the whole, I would like to teach people more about how accounting and what their role is in accounting. Started me down that pathway.
So I would remind everyone on the call today, you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions or share your observations, as well as to post them. I am keeping an eye on the chat. So if you are shy about saying outright, but you'd like to post something, please do so, and I will let Judy know. In the meantime, of course, I'm going to keep the conversation going. So I encourage you to participate as well. Please don't hesitate to unmute yourself. I'm going to give everybody a moment to find that mute button. So Judy, oh, excuse me, go ahead.
I think it's interesting that my birth mom, both my sister and I have met my birth mom, that my biological father was aware that we existed, and chose to go his own pathway. But my biological mom, as I said, married an American GI, and she is much, much more traditional Japanese. My mom adapted to being an American, and she is currently back in Japan. She is still alive. But the differences in their personalities, one being more traditional American and one being very, very traditional Japanese. So
Judy, Ken has posted in the chat. Can you tell us your thoughts on the internment camps?
Yes, I most certainly can. I find it interesting that because the Americans felt that the Japanese were more of a threat, one, because of bombing of Pearl Harbor, but because they felt they were closer, the Japanese were closer, and a lot of them lived in California, that they were more of a threat. But to inter US citizens and take their property away was a crime, in my opinion, because they were never compensated. And the idea that they were readily identifiable, I think is, you can look at a Japanese person and say, oh, well, you're Oriental, and so therefore we can put you in an internment camp. We had one here in Colorado, which I'm not sure 100% of people are aware of. And the conditions were not idyllic. I think we tend to think, oh, well, the internment camps were, paradise compared to, I don't know, jail or something like that. And they were not. So I just think it's a very sad situation that we felt it was okay to do that.
You used the word Oriental when you talked about it, which would have been typical during those times, right? What are the correct words today?
Asian, what is it? Pacific Islander, it's AAPI. So
Caitlin asks, what would you say was the hardest obstacle for you growing up?
I think the hardest obstacle for me and my sister as well is the fact that my mom tended to avoid situations that would put her in the, I don't want to say limelight, but put her with other people that she was uncomfortable with. So in other words, we couldn't join Girl Scouts. We couldn't join clubs, etc., because she might be asked to do something that she wasn't comfortable doing, which is participating as a Girl Scout leader or something along those lines. And she did not want to have to do that because she wasn't familiar with it. And at that point, she was the only parent. It's not something my dad would do or could do. And so she avoided all those things. So, you know, we weren't allowed to have people spend the night, those kinds of things, because it made her uncomfortable. And it's interesting, when she got Alzheimer's, she was only comfortable with her immediate family. So, because it was familiar to her.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And in that sense, that's kind of what I meant by your mother's not like other people's mothers, because she did not want to call any attention to herself whatsoever.
So what happened in junior high that you and Joyce didn't have to dress alike anymore?
Another one of those, you know, I am not the perfect child thing. My mom continued to make the same outfits for my sister and I, and I pitched a fit. I said, I don't want you to make my clothes anymore. And so from that point forward, she would not make my clothes anymore. And so therefore we did not have the same clothes to wear at the same time.
So we
Always the
titled this
rebel.
series, when we put it together, we built it around stories of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What was it like for you along the way around the whole inclusion question with other kids?
It's interesting because in Japan, there were a lot of other half and half kids, because we went to a Department of Defense school. But when we came to the United States, we were kind of the oddballs. One, because we were twins, and two, because we were Japanese twins. And so people looked at us a little bit differently because we are in a military, well, for part of the time we were in military schools, but then we started to live outside of military housing. So we went to private schools. And when you're in some areas of the country, you are definitely outside of what is considered the norm. So we were stationed at Fort Hood, and we're in Killeen, Texas.
Yeah.
And we're definitely not like everybody else's kids. So, you know, you do get teased. You don't fit in necessarily. And so you don't necessarily have friends because you're very transient, number one, and number two, you don't look like everybody else. So
to that point, what advice would you give those of us who do tend to look like everybody else about how to be better?
How to be more welcoming?
Yeah.
I think I think that's kind of the whole thing with DE&I is you have to look beyond what the person looks like or how the person talks, and accept them for who they are. Because we see it all the time is, or how the person dresses even. We make that rapid judgment about a person. And once we've made that rapid judgment about a person, it's very difficult to change your mind. You may find 9 months later that you like the person, but you've already made an initial judgment. And I think it's very difficult to switch gears to say, I like that person. I didn't realize that about that person. And you don't know. I mean, we all tend to do that. That it's that whole first impression or judge a book by its cover. And I think that was the issue that my mom had is she has a very heavy accent, or not very heavy. At that point, it wasn't very heavy, is that people automatically assume she doesn't know how to speak English very well.
Or that she likes Japanese food.
Right.
Yeah.
Or she doesn't like some other kind of food because she is, she must like Japanese food, but she doesn't like Southern food. She must not like okra or whatever the case may be, which she did because that's what she learned to cook from my dad, because he was from the South. So, yeah, I think it's that uncut.
Best thing about having this rich family background.
Yes, I agree. And you're introduced to so many different things by having a very broad background. Oh, I heard someone talk.
Yeah, this is Alicia. I thought maybe I'd just ask my question out there rather than typing it because I get hung up on my words. But Judy, I really appreciate you sharing your story and just think it's a beautiful display of what it's like to live in two places and have so much rich story, not just in where you came from or where your family came from, but just in the story of adoption. So I appreciate both aspects. My question is actually, I think I've asked this a little bit before, but your perspective on how, just as American, I would say American culture is kind of going under a little bit of an identity crisis of what does it look like for our culture to accept lots of different cultures? And so we're like opening our eyes to all these different perspectives. What's your insights into maybe how Japan has changed since the time of your mother coming from Japan, and what's her relationship with Japanese culture now?
I think that Japan is very racist. I think that if you talk to, they're less so than they used to be, but they are still very closed as far as we are the superior Asian race. And so they're not as open to accepting people. And part of that has to do with the fact that they're, a very small group of islands, so they can only accept so many people. But I think that they're very imperialistic in their attitudes about accepting other Orientals, not so much other cultures overall, but definitely bigoted in their attitudes towards other Orientals. And so, and that's been traditional. I mean, if you watch documentaries, etc., about the Japanese people and their attitudes towards Chinese and Koreans and people from the Philippines, etc., and you think, is that really true? And it is. I would listen to my mother talk about other Asian races, and you would pick up on that very quickly. And I would think, how many of those have you come across that you would be able to form that opinion? And like I said, I think they're a lot more open about different Asian races and more open about other ethnic groups other than Asians. But it's really, really fascinating because you would think they would not be, but they definitely are biased, I guess is how I will put it. And I think part of it has to do with landmass, and part of it has to do with the different sects of Buddhism that exist.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's interesting, isn't it, that if you only view the world through the American lens, you would think that only America has racist or racism tendencies, right?
Right.
And to your point, Judy, it's not, we don't corner the market on that either.
No.
It's really interesting. Other questions or observations?
Hi, Judy. This is Ken. I do have one question. Our history is taught so one-sided in the United States. And I'm just curious as to, from your perspective with the Japanese culture, if you think it's as one-sided. Like, for instance, 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, there was the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, and my wife's grandfather was a victim, died from that invasion. But we never hear about it in the US. I mean, I don't think I've ever read it in a history book here. You have to dig pretty deep. How do you see that from the Japanese perspective? Do you feel like it's very one-sided like ours is?
I can't tell you for sure because I've never attended school, a Japanese school, but just from listening to my mom and her friends, that I would tell you that it's one-sided as well. I think that, for example, German history is not as one-sided as Japanese history or American history. But again, it's a matter of, I think it goes back to face. We're going to make ourselves look pristine. Probably not pristine because I doubt it's that clean, but what I'm saying, we want to bring honor, no shame to our culture. And so we're not going to, publish our dirty laundry.
And then a follow-up question. I have 3 Vietnamese children, and they're confused all the time, and they've really been hit hard with being, responsible for the so-called China virus and such. Do you feel that as well? That, a lot of people don't obviously know the difference, but are you seeing that as well?
I'm not personally, because most people have no clue that I am Asian at all, but I have seen it amongst some of the other Asians. So personally, no. I would be very worried if my mother was still alive. Very much so. Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Ken, I can only imagine how challenging that is for your kids. And
Yes.
perhaps you have a piece of best advice for the rest of us about that too.
Well, I don't know. I think just the intolerance needs to go away. Like, for instance, back in March of last year, one of my sons who worked at Ross Dress for Less, somebody came in and started yelling at him for being Asian and Chinese and actually decked him to the floor with a slugging him. And it's like, what the heck is going on? And then tried to accuse him of other things, and they had to go to the video cameras and whatnot. But and then my daughter, would get the same thing, and people yelling at her as if she didn't speak English, like there's no intelligence there, and just a lot of just really silly stuff.
And tough for a parent.
Yes.
Incredibly tough for a parent. Thank you for sharing that as well. Other comments? We have a few minutes left here. Okay, then if not, there are lots of thank yous coming into the chat, Judy, and I would say the same thing. Thank you so much for giving us the context as well as sharing your story. There are things that at least for me, there are things I never thought about until you talked about them, and I really appreciate that. The video was incredibly poignant to me. I can only imagine what that must have been like for those young women trying to figure out how to live in a completely different world and with probably not very much friendly help.
Yeah.
Especially once their husbands started traveling, right?
Yes. It was interesting in all the research that I did, how much they struggled to fit in with very little help.
Yeah. Joan writes in the chat, Judy, thank you for a wonderful history lesson and challenge to be more welcoming. Well done.
Thank you.
I would remind everyone here, and please pass along to your friends as well. Our next See Me story will be October 27, I think it is. Yes, October 27, noon to 1:15 Mountain Time. And Felicia Clement will talk about the CPA profession through a colored lens. She is a member of our DE&I working group as well. And Felicia is a Black CPA whose primary focus in her business is in supporting micro businesses. So very, very small businesses from a consulting perspective. We also, just FYI, you can look forward, have November scheduled and 2 events in December. December 1st will be our women's panel, the facets of what it's like to be female in the profession. And then on December 22nd, Ken, who was asking that question earlier of Judy, will be doing December 22nd with his daughters from Sierra Leone, whom he and his wife adopted, and a completely different perspective on what it's like to come from a world like that into America. Then in January, we will be back. So we are doing January through April already scheduled as well for 2022. And in addition, we have begun to partner with our colleagues at the Maryland Association of CPAs who are now able to participate in this program. So we may have some Maryland folks online today, and we welcome you. We also may have some stories coming from them. In January, we will have a wonderful presentation, I am certain, from Dan Hawkinson, on the LGBTQ, there we go, aspect of being in the profession. February, Judy is working on with her colleagues at Regis to have a couple of DACA students, so undocumented immigrant students who are here on the Delayed Action Program, not DECA, but DACA. Let's see, in March, one of our members will be talking about what it's been like for her entering the profession, having gotten all of her education through online college. And then in April, Lisa Hackard will join us to tell her story from a mental health perspective. So look forward to all of those, and thank you so much for being here with us today. I hope you'll come back, and I hope you'll tell your friends and encourage them to participate too. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, and goodbye.